the reading says that Jesus used this figure of speech. He used this image of the shepherd to explain to his disciples something. And the image of a shepherd is something that's used throughout the Bible. We hear about shepherds all the time. Just to give some examples, both the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah used the image of a shepherd to talk about Israel's false shepherds, the leaders that were leading them astray, and calling Israel to come back to God, the true shepherd. King David, of course, was a shepherd. When he was a child and a young man, killed Goliath with his smooth stones. David was a shepherd. There's multiple mentions of shepherds in the Psalms, including Psalm 23, a favorite for many people, which we read today. And then there's Isaiah's famous passage in chapter 40. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother's sheep. Now, of course, when you hit the Gospels, there's plenty of shepherds too. You can remember that the shepherds play a very important part in the Christmas pageant, a whole flock of them. And Jesus is said to have likened the people following after him like sheep without a shepherd. And then, of course, you get to John 10, which we read part of just now. Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Now, in talking to his disciples, Jesus called himself a good shepherd. And it's a pretty detailed chapter. We read about half of it. The shepherd was an image that he thought would really help people understand something about who he was, and therefore who they as disciples would need to be also. So there's something about his role as a shepherd and also our role as a shepherd, if we want to follow in Jesus' way. But of course, we don't see a lot of shepherds walking around Trumbull. And I think that we don't have a good idea of what shepherds back then were actually like. We probably have a romanticized idea of what a shepherd is, maybe over in the pastoral fields of England where everything's green and the shepherd wears a little Bo Peep outfit and sits, serenely with a little crook and, slumbers while the sheep pastorally graze. There are pietistic paintings or children's books that portray shepherds as very meek and very mild. And then there's that mistaken idea, I think, that we too as disciples are to be meek and mild and soft like that, like a gentle little Bo Peep or something. But real shepherds would not have had pale skin and soft hands like we see in those pietistic paintings or children's books. Because shepherds in the Middle East, which was a rough terrain, a desert really, spent day and night outside in the elements. And they were working people. So they would have been more leathery looking, I think, than soft and pastoral. They walked for miles and miles into the mountains and the rugged areas. The valleys that would have had any green at all were much too important for farming back then to have sheep there. They wanted to keep the sheep away from those areas. So the shepherds had to get those sheep way up into the rugged areas and away from the valleys. Now these shepherds would build little stone enclosures up in there, and at night they would herd the sheep into the stone enclosures. They would be around, and then they'd have an open passageway, and the shepherd would sleep right in there. So the shepherd was the gate, keeping the sheep in. So they slept outside on rocks. They also went digging after sheep who got lost in the underbrush or got stuck out on outcroppings. And they certainly didn't go home to a snug little English cottage at the end of the day, to a nice little feather bed. So real shepherds were kind of tough. And they weren't averse to hard work or long walks or challenging conditions. And of course, when we read the life of Jesus, we know that describes him very well. I suppose we as disciples need to be willing to dig in too, and to get to work, to go the distance and get some thick skin for our journey. A good shepherd is willing to move out into the wilderness, leaving soft comfort behind. And the Christian faith is a pilgrim faith. And like shepherds, we disciples are, in a sense, rootless strangers in our world. You have to be tough to be a nomad like a shepherd. Back in those days, sheep were a very valuable commodity. They were valuable for their meat, for their wool, and for their milk. And the shepherds had to tend carefully to the sheep to encourage them to have the best possible yield in all three areas. They had to make sure that they could find the right food and the right amount of food to make sure the meat was good and marbled and all that. They had to keep the sheep away from brambles and burrs and mud that would make their wool less valuable. And they'd have to milk their sheep, and the shepherds actually made cheese out there in the wilderness with the sheep's milk. Now, Jesus also drew gifts out of his disciples and helped them to yield 30, 50, even 100-fold, as he says in one of his parables. And as disciples, in our interactions with each other, or with ourselves, I guess, we too need to remember that our words and our actions are important. We can squash, or we can foster growth by what we do and say. We can put others down, or we can lift them up. Just a few resentful or hurtful words or thoughts can diminish yields in the world. We can limit ourselves or others, or do everything we can to encourage abundant life. As Jesus said, I came to bring life and bring it abundantly. A good shepherd does everything possible to steward a good yield in all the areas of one's life. One of the shepherd's biggest attributes would have been awareness also. A good ear, like that ear on the front of the booklet. And a good eye. The shepherds would watch the clouds and predict the weather, observe the sheep's behavior closely to understand whether one of them was feeling sick or needed some attention. Have to be very vigilant for signs of predators and danger for the flock. The shepherd would have been able to distinguish between all kinds of sounds, listening for the approach of predators or the bleating of a sheep out in the distance. The shepherd would have to be aware of which plants suited the sheep and where to find them, and aware of the countless signs that nature gives to a person whose life depends on being aware of it. Jesus, too, was keenly aware, not only about his disciples and their needs, but also in tune with his own needs for rest, for prayer, for food, and certainly in tune to listening for God's voice. I thought it was interesting when we made this mistake in the booklet and put the Acts reading twice, and Fiona said, you're going to have to listen to this one. How did you feel? We're so used to relying on our eyes, aren't we? We have to tune every way of bringing things in. Like a good shepherd, Jesus opened the eyes and ears of his heart and was able to pick up on God's signals, just like a shepherd could pick up on nature's signals, and then responded accordingly to what he became aware of. And we as disciples, too, need to strive to be more open to God and to ourselves and to one another and to the needs of the world, so that we, too, can pick up on the signals and respond accordingly. Now, shepherds were often solitary, but there were also times when they had to come together in groups. They did that that night outside of Bethlehem when we hear the Easter story. There was a whole group of shepherds out there tending their flocks by night. And oftentimes shepherds would come together and they'd herd their sheep into one big flock. They'd share the responsibilities. They'd share the task of going to town and getting food. They'd have community among themselves out there in the wild. And certainly Jesus modeled this thing with his original disciples too, as they went from town to town together, sharing everything in common. And we in the church are called to come together with other disciples this way, to share our resources, our work, our responsibilities, to share meals, to create a community of common purpose together, like shepherds. The other thing that strikes me about shepherds, too, is that unlike now, where every bit of land that we know is fenced off into private parcels, back then there was a lot of land that was not owned by anyone. It was common land, and it was out on the outskirts of the towns and villages. And the shepherds would go out into these regions with their flocks to find their good feeding grounds, but by doing so, they weren't only taking care of their own flocks, they were taking care of the common land. They were stewarding that common land, keeping the brush down, keeping an eye on things, being out there to see what's going on in the outskirts of their own village. The shepherd gave this benefit to the whole community. And Jesus, too, did not come to serve only a few. He said he came to give light to the whole world. So perhaps we as disciples need to be mindful of what we do for the common good beyond our village of this building, for the benefit of the whole body, of the whole world, not just focusing on our own lives, our own family, and our own comfort and our own salvation. A good shepherd serves something bigger than him or herself. A good shepherd goes out into the places that have no owners and finds ways to steward the world. So this image of a shepherd, it's not only about Jesus, but it's about you and it's about me. When Jesus appeared to Peter after his resurrection, he asked him not once but 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" 3 times he asked, generously giving Peter a chance to make amends for his 3 heart-wrenching denials that he'd made before Jesus' death. "Peter, do you love me?" And each time Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And each of the 3 times Jesus told him, "Then feed my sheep." Jesus, the Good Shepherd, passed on his role as shepherd to Peter, the founder of the church. So being shepherds is something we're all called to do. We're not Christian disciples to be sheep, well-fed and tended by our personal Lord and Savior. We are Christians to carry on the work of the Good Shepherd by being strong, courageous, and tough, willing to leave our own comfort behind, by being supportive of ourselves and of others, and seeking to bring out the best in us all, by being open, awake, and aware with open hearts to God, to one another and ourselves and the needs of the world, by seeking true community that shares all things from our riches to our wounds, and by devoting our lives to serving something bigger than just ourselves. And when we do follow in the footsteps of our shepherd, there will be nothing to fear. For though we travel in the valley of the shadow of death, God is with us and comforts us. Surely, walking this shepherd's walk, goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our lives, and we will live in the house of the Lord forever.